All right, good morning, everyone. We are looking at Esther 2:19 through 20. So if you turn there in the Word of God, and actually we finished up with that last Thursday, we will be looking at verses 21 through 23 as well and finish the chapter today. Page 65 in your notes is where we'll begin. So Esther 2:19, we'll start there. Page 65. All right, before we begin, let's make sure that we prepare to focus and have the right mindset. Here in Ecclesiastes 12:13, we have a verse here. This is Solomon, and so he obviously did a lot of things during his life, widely known as perhaps the smartest man alive ever, and God blessed him with wisdom in this regard. But one of the things that he did, he was also incredibly wealthy, and he got under his old sin nature for a time. And he pursued various things where money was no object, and he pursued pleasure and everything, and all types of pursuits. But when he boiled it down at the end, he said this: the conclusion when all has been heard is fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. So this applies, of course, to us as well. Fearing God is not, again, some emotional fear. It is a matter of respect. It's taking God seriously. In our day and age now, taking God seriously by assembling in Bible class when we do have Bible class and learning his word, and that's part of not just learning it, but applying it as well. So that's keeping his commandments, and this applies to everyone. So there are no exceptions to this. This is something that, if you look at it, even Jesus Christ in his humanity was subject to these requirements, and we see even. Not only did he grow physically, but he grew spiritually as well in his humanity as well. And in this sense, he was very pleasing to God. Of course, he's unique, and he didn't have an old sin nature. However, we have a way for us to deal with the old sin nature. We still have to keep pursuing God and his plan, keeping his commandments. So with this in mind, let's make sure that we are in fellowship. Excuse me. Make sure we're in fellowship and prepare to concentrate. This is a context here in Esther that there's a lot of intrigue. There's a lot of, at this point, we're just sorting out the characters. Esther is not as clean as we might think. And we're going to see, too, that Mordecai has his issues with authority. And then along comes the biggest antagonist there is, at least in this account, and that is Haman. And he is someone who is going to get really angry because he's disrespected. And then you would think a little bit of retaliation. Yeah, more than a little, just because of the offense of primarily one person in the context, he devises a plan to kill all of the Jews. That is the epitome of being an anti-Semite, anti-Jewish, and so forth. So it is something, though, that we see in our day and age where we have people that resort to violence. And not just that, but we have an assassination plot we have to work through here. So you look around now, and the occurrences of violence are every day. I mean, it's almost to the point where we're kind of numb, desensitized by it, but we have violence everywhere we look. And so obviously as believers, we have to deal with this and have the biblical perspective as always. As God has said, his thoughts are not our thoughts, his ways are not our ways. So our goal then is, as we fear God and keep his commandments, try to adjust our conduct, behavior, thinking to his standard. So take a few moments, rebound if you need to, and I'll begin with the word of prayer. Let us pray. Father, thank you for this privilege we have this morning to look at your Bible doctrine. I pray that you would give us wisdom in these matters. Bless this class to our further spiritual advancement as we endeavor to please you. In Christ's name I pray, amen. Okay, Esther 2:19. I should say before we begin, I was reminded this morning that it's Faith Bible Church's 33rd anniversary. So we have been in existence for 33 years as a local church, and that's significant, where you take a stand for Bible doctrine. And as far as I know, there's not many churches out there that actually go verse by verse in a detailed manner and really make their mission, if you will, to be the classroom of Christianity and disseminate the whole counsel of the Word of God. As Paul said, to some of the elders and so forth at Ephesus, he said, look, basically my conscience is clean. I've done my job. I have not shrink or been reluctant to declare the whole counsel of God to people as well. And so that is what we stand for. The pastor who preceded me, Tom Balding, did that as well. He fulfilled his ministry, and God, is at the appropriate time, his timing took Tom home, and I became a pastor here, and I'm in my 14th year. In February, it'll be my 15th year, so it's kind of hard to believe, but as a church, we've been around for 33 years. So I always think, too, when we have these, to me, big numbers, I think, well, where am I? Where have I come and so forth? Have I progressed? Where do I need to improve? That kind of thing. And indeed, you should be, too. If you've been here for 33 years and, then there's certain areas that should be pretty cleaned up. And if they're not, then we have to honestly take a look as believers and say, okay, what do I need to do? And certainly we can't just go out, and just keep on. I mean, if you're not consistent in Bible class after 33 years, then you have issues. And it's one of those things that, as we've just seen a verse in Ecclesiastes, we're not following then Solomon's advice. And he's a pretty smart guy, but he says, fear God is keep his commandments. One of his commandments for us in the church age, Hebrews 10:25. And we could probably recite it in our sleep. But do we listen to it? Nah, sometimes not. And separation as well. So these are really core doctrines that, it's like, well, if I'm not doing well on these, then you need to make progress and so forth. And by no means rationalize or, push it under the carpet, look the other way. No, we have to tackle these issues head on and make progress. Especially, again, this should be weighty, 33 years. And yes, we know life is a vapor and so forth, but 33 years in pursuing Bible doctrine. So again, ask yourself, and this is your deal, your issue, your Christian way of life, how far are you? Where do you need to go? What improvements do you need to make? And then make them. So anyway, it is, we do have a legacy, although not many in numbers, but we have a legacy of pursuing the truth, and I want to keep doing that as far as we can. That's what I pray to God for, and no compromise. We just keep plugging away at sound doctrine until we're raptured out, or otherwise, God takes us home. So one way or another, and that is up to him, his discretion. This is his ministry. So, all right, to our context here in Esther 2:19. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not yet made known her kindred or her people, even as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther did what Mordecai told her, as she had done when under his care. As we pointed out on Thursday, she wasn't obligated to listen to him anymore, because who was she now? Well, she was queen. She actually outranked him, and it wasn't like he was her father, because he wasn't. He raised her, as his own daughter. So you had this, and they were family, of course. They were cousins. But in every sense of the word, she did not have to. Legitimately, she was the queen of Persia here. Yet she did. She respected him and his wisdom and so forth. And so she did listen to him. But we were looking here at verse 19 on Thursday and how it's caused some interpreters some problems. This whole idea or situation where you have virgins gathered the second time, really to reduce it down to the bottom line, basically is just referring to the women originally involved with the competition that, came from all the provinces of the Persian Empire. And then there was a contest, Esther won, and then this is the women here. We see this is, again, the purpose of doing this is to fix a time frame. And here you see around this time, right after the contest, right after Esther was queen, became queen. You also have this this mention here by the author in the end of verse 19. Then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. This is again a revealing, and now that we know that Mordecai has a position within King Ahasuerus' administration and in some place in his palace. It's not literally that Mordecai is sitting at the actual gate. Remaining, this was Susa. There was, it was a very large city. And so this is figurative for the fact that he had an office, and he was a ranking authority within the Persian administration here. We still don't know, really what he did before, but based on his access and so forth, he would have had some prominence, we can at least say. And, we have enough detail to know. Obviously, what's important has been revealed, even if we don't have certain specifics. So then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, and then we see that Esther still continued to keep everything secret. And, she didn't, again, we surmise that Mordecai, figured there was some anti-Jewish feeling among the Persians, and we will see that is not ill-founded because we have Haman who comes out, and this type of plan, it just doesn't spring up overnight like, we're going to kill all the Jews. This has to be something that there's some type of prejudice before or issues with that, obviously. You're not getting that upset and then proposing this plan without some prior ill feelings too. That's my take on that. We don't know anything about Haman other than what's revealed right here in our book, but we see there's some interesting parallels too. Some of his descendants and son of Mordecai's descendants. It's kind of interesting, but we'll look at that when we come to that. And I'm not saying that it's like the Hatfield McCoys fighting through generations or anything like that, but it's interesting to just think, I wonder if, Mordecai knew of his descendants, and you wonder if Haman knew of his descendants, and then the role that way back, your great, grandfather or whatever fought so-and-so, because we actually have some interesting connections here with the Amalekites and of course, the Benjamites, which one of the most notable Benjamites, King Saul. So anyway, we'll deal with that later. But we see here that Esther's following as she had been, not revealing who she, that she was a Jew, and also not revealing that she's in any way related to Mordecai. All right, to verses 21 through 23. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Now, when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on a gallows, and was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. So the analysis here are verses 21 through 23. 1. While Mordecai was serving as an administrator, two of the king's officials became angry with Ahasuerus and planned to kill him. Now, 2, the names of the would-be assassins are revealed as Bigthan and Teresh. We don't really know anything about them other than what's revealed here. And they had a grudge with the king to the point where they plotted to assassinate him. So 3, we have only the barest of details regarding these two, for they are described as from those who guarded the door, perhaps referring to their capacity as personal guards to the king. Those who would have, presumably here, they could have close access to the king, in his private palace and so forth. Remember, the king kept to his own quarters and had his own palace structure and so forth within Susa. Sometimes, remember, we refer to it as, earlier on in chapter 1, as part of the citadel. So we would think of it as a king's palace. So they perhaps likely that they were part of the personal guards to the king. When you say those who guarded the door, you think of what door? Well, maybe, just in a sense, access to the king. So they were right there. Furthermore, the author doesn't provide the reason for their anger. They just became angry. But again, there's certain details we do have and we don't have, so we have to move on from that. Now, 6, simply that their anger led to a plot to kill the king of the Persian Empire. That's all we know. And to the extent of their anger here, let's put it in context. This is a plot to kill the most powerful ruler on the planet at the time. That's pretty angry and pretty bold. And we don't know, likely 2 guys wanting to pull this off. Probably not. There's probably some other accomplices we are unaware of. But these 2 for sure went down. Of course, as we already know, they were executed for this. But here, 7, our phrase became angry connotes an uncontrolled anger or fury. And this is this word katsaf. It's not just, oh, I'm annoyed. This is, I'm furious. We understand there's a difference. And especially if you're going to kill someone, assassinate them. 8, such fury leads to irrational acts, as we have in our verses. Also see Haman. Haman had the same kind of anger, this uncontrolled fury. How dare you disrespect me, Mordecai? You're not bowing down when I come in your presence. This is the ego here in play. And because Mordecai didn't bow down, then this just infuriated Haman. 9, anger left unchecked can be devastating. Genesis 4:6. Cain and Abel. So we have issues here right off the bat. Again, human race is off to a rough start after the fall, right? Lying, all these different things. We have anger, murder. What do you expect? It's the devil's world now. After the fall, then the wheels came off. God provided an escape route, which we have taken with believing in Jesus Christ. But other than that, look around you and look at Genesis. Not much has changed, right? But no, we'll get better, we'll improve, and this is why in certain cities you want to dismantle the police department, because instead of police, we're going to have a community, violence prevention units. What is that? What I thought the police did that in many cases. So this is one of those things where the rejection of authority, this is huge here, but we see this in the last days. This is a prominent feature on the planet. In the last days, you have rejection of authority. And look no further than, rejection. And of course, there are abuses. There most definitely are abuses on law enforcement. However, this is something that you have to have law and order, and that's it. Then you have that one area, I forget what they named it, in Seattle. So you have the rejection of authority, and then you have authorities that aren't using their authority properly, and so they will allow a group of protesters to have their own. I'm not sure if it's still in existence. It was just the other day. But it's a law enforcement free zone, police free zone, and basically it's essentially a commune of people that is being allowed to exist for political purposes, of course. And so they don't want any law enforcement in there, unless of course there's an emergency or stuff like that. But and their idea is that in this little niche in Seattle, there's going to be peace, love, and justice and peace. Remember these things we've been talking about. But what do you have? Discord. You have murder. All right. You do have violence among these peaceful people. Go figure, right? They have old sin natures. Violence doesn't just lay down because you want it. You want justice and peace. This is it. So, this is something that you look around and you have to, again, be very careful and not get swept in the emotion in either case, in either way, because, and you have to recognize some of the arguments and so forth. There are abuses, but you need law and order, period. It is a pipe dream, and actually very, very dangerous to think that you can exist without some type of police force. It's been tried before. This is the thing. You know the word utopia? This is a philosophical concept that basically mankind will improve and we will evolve into something better, that essentially we will not have these other things such as these vices, murder, these types of things. We will improve to such a point where we can peacefully coexist. But how does that all come about? Well, philosophically, it comes about through our efforts, what we do, how we relate to one another. What does the Word of God say? Never. It will never come through our efforts. The only way, as we've just studied, we will have peace, justice, and an actual, righteousness is when the Lord Jesus Christ comes back. And this will only be effected through His power. In the meantime, God has established authorities for our protection. And again, this idea that, an authority is being abusive, so therefore we get rid of the authority. No, we don't. Think about it. And this is the thing where even a lot of believers get caught up into this. And I read an article recently too. The idea that, the Romans, they're one of the most abusive powers around, the Caesars and so forth. And yet, what does the Bible say? Well, it's very telling that we have in Romans 13, you pay attention, you obey your authorities. And this is in Rome. So Christians need to wake up and see that, look, you have to have this. And it's not, of course, there's going to be abuses, but again, human authorities are imperfect, but you must have them. It is part of, the divine institution of nation and part of civic law and order. You have to have it. To me, one of the reasons why I find it annoying, first of all, it violates Bible doctrine right off the bat, okay? Secondly, if you want to purely leave the Bible out of it, just hypothetically, and look at it from a historical perspective, has it ever happened? No. And like I said, have people tried before? It's not like we're facing new issues. Have people tried to stop these injustices, various injustices, and live peacefully and coexist and be nice? Well, of course. Has it ever worked? Maybe on a limited basis, but certainly not long term. Look at where we are today. Okay? So what does that mean? We keep trying and doing the very same thing that has never worked for thousands of years and abolish a police force, abolish law enforcement? That's crazy. Okay? And it displays a lack of intelligence, a lack of knowledge of history. So those are just some of the, really, it displays holes in your thinking if you think that. A lot of people do. Some people, worldly types, what? No police force? Just right off the bat, it's like, even if you're not crazy about law enforcement, like, what? No police? Yeah, okay, now you start thinking through certain scenarios. Okay, what about the gangs? They'll respect that, I'm sure of it. All these different things. And they won't bother you because, they just know that, they'll respect all these things, right? No, they won't. There's no respect. There's murder. There's mayhem. All these different things. I don't expect this anti-law enforcement in terms of abolishing whole police departments. It might happen. Be an interesting thing. I think what's going on in Minneapolis is a human experiment. And that if they abolish that police force, be very interesting to see, what happens there. If I'm a criminal, which I'm not, if I had a criminal mindset and I'm thinking, I'm looking at communities that are perhaps just going over to more community policing and violence prevention without actual law enforcement, I'm all over it. It's like, Let's develop a network there or whatever. I mean, this is something that violence prevention, there's no, again, there's no law. There's no order. There's no enforcement. All right, so here in our notes, we see anger left unchecked can be devastating, Genesis 4:6. Then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door and its desires for you, but you must master it. Here dealing with the old sin nature, and ultimately we know Cain is an unbeliever. So there's a lot going on here. But what we're looking at is the fact that this key old sin nature trait for him, anger, and what it leads to. And Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel's brother and killed him, literally murdered him. So this is what the anger led to. It wasn't just simply, I'm offended. It's offended and, I'm going to kill him. 2 Chronicles 16:10. Starting in verse 7 here. 2 Chronicles 16:7. At this point, we understand that, with the kings of Israel, first you had Saul, then you had David, then you have Solomon. After that, you had basically a civil war and you had a divided kingdom. You had Israel and Judah. Israel's northern kingdom, Samaria, sometimes Judah. Here is the southern kingdom. So here, dealing with Asa, king of Judah. 7, at the time, Hananiah the seer came to Asa, king of Judah, and said to him, because you have relied on the king of Aram and have not relied on the Lord your God, therefore the army of the king of Aram has escaped out of your hand. Here, basically a comment on this. You don't make, alliances here, improper alliances, and that's one of the things that he's being condemned for, especially instead of relying on the Lord. 8, were not the Ethiopians and the Lubim an immense army with very many chariots and horsemen? Yet because you relied on the Lord, he delivered them into your hand. For the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his. You have acted foolishly in this. Indeed, from now on, you will surely have wars. God, if you relied on him, okay, you would fight a war, but he's fighting for you and you're going to have peace because he's going to make sure of this. Now, because you've relied on your own strength or improper alliances, you're going to have war. You're not going to have periods of peace that are very beneficial. So what was Asa's response here? 10, then Asa was angry with the seer and put him in prison, for he was enraged at him for this. And Asa oppressed some of the people at the same time. So this was no good, but you see anger, this seer, this is a prophet. This is essentially synonymous with being a prophet. So he's throwing a prophet of the Lord into prison. He's absolutely enraged by him. And then Psalm 37:8. Cease from anger and forsake wrath. Do not fret here. Do not worry. It leads only to evil doing. So here you have anger, wrath, right here. Don't do it. And then, of course, with worry, it leads only to evil doing, which we see is entirely true. Cain's anger led to the murder of Abel. Asa's anger, his rage, led to the imprisonment of Hananiah. 10, at some point, their plot became known to Mordecai. Here, Bigthan and Teresh, those eunuchs here. 11, he promptly informed Esther, who in turn told the king. 12, note, Esther gave credit to Mordecai. So, it was in, Mordecai's name, essentially. So she's not taking credit for it. So, 13, the role Mordecai played in this matter would fully come to light at a later date. Here, Esther 6:2, go back there. This was when the plot was known. And, again, we will run into it where once the king made a proclamation, then it couldn't be revoked. But we'll deal with that. But one of the things that we see is that now Ahasuerus really sees Mordecai's role in and basically loyalty to him. 6:1, during that night, the king could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the book of records, the chronicles, and they were read before the king, and it was found written that Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, that they sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So this is, he will be given full credit later, but at this point, what he has said is just recorded. 14, the report of the plot was investigated and confirmed. We see in verse 23, Esther 2:23, now when the plot was investigated and found to be so. So they did their due diligence and looked out and examined all the evidence, whatever they had at that particular point. And they found out that it was all true. So 15, consequently, both of the perpetrators, Bigthan and Teresh, were executed. Now 16, hanged on the gallows pertains to A, capital punishment, of course. B, literally, this is hanged upon a tree. Now, we think of, if you say hanged, someone was hung, what comes to mind? Well, we think of, right, maybe an old Western or something like that, or something, the noose, and someone with a bag over their head, floor drops, they're hung, they're executed. This is not really the case when you look at this, kind of an interesting thing here. Even though it's literally hanged upon a tree, we say gallows because that's a popular interpretation, but C, likely this involves impalement on wooden stakes, not strangulation with a noose. I'll let your imagination go there. There's wood, there's a stake, and you're impaled on it. That's how you die. You're not strangled. No, that is a rough way to go. D, a remote but possible reference to crucifixion. The Persians practiced crucifixion. Crucifixion was not strictly a Roman way of execution. It is one thing that was, of course, widely used by the Romans, but it was not exclusively Roman. This type of execution predated the Roman Empire by quite a bit, but you see that Persia also at times used crucifixion, but probably not. It was probably impalement when you look at the historical record. And by the historical record, writers, ancient writers like Herodotus and so forth, who was a Greek writer, and others that they make mention of, basically execution, various things like that. And like in the New Testament, we've looked at Josephus, some of his accounts, and like the destruction of Jerusalem, that kind of thing. So we look at some of these historical records, and then from that we can infer, okay, so this probably is not strangulation at all, even though that's what we think of in our modern context. This is impalement, more than likely. E, To hang on a tree was to publicly display the body of one who was executed. So this is what happened. Someone technically could be executed any which way. Okay, you could stone them to death. You can impale them, in this case, in the Persian Empire, somehow execute them. Then what you would do is that there are cases where you could actually hang someone and strangle them, as we will see later on, that that's more or less what Haman had in store or wanted to have done. But what you have is then you hang the body up. So you are hanging the body up, but you're hanging the body up for display. This is dishonor. It's not how you died. It's just displaying the dead body to the public. So to hang on a tree was to publicly display the body of one who was executed. Deuteronomy 21:22. It's pretty graphic, I know, but this is what we have here. It is capital punishment. Well, it's interesting here. This has to do with rebellious son and who will not listen to authorities and is basically entrenched in his way. Starting in verse 18, if any man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father or his mother, when they chastise him, he will not even listen to them. Then his father and mother shall seize him and bring him out to the elders of the city at the gateway of his hometown. And they shall say to the elders of the city, the son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He's a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of this city, of his city, shall stone him to death. So you shall remove the evil from your midst, and all Israel shall hear of it and fear. So interesting here under this, extreme disobedience by a child could be a capital offense. This is extreme though, but and it's not simply just for being a glutton and a drunkard. It's just a completely worthless son that will not listen to any sense. Doctrinal sense will not, in this case, apply the law or anything like that. And so he is then executed. And then here, you notice too, one of the things, not only is there justice in the execution, that this is what's called for, but after this has to have a preventative effect. This is why, part of the reason why it's done, not just to, deal with the sin, but also other people looking on, so they will not engage in the same kind of sin. So it should be a preventative. Verse 21, so they stone him to death, so you shall remove the evil from your midst, and all Israel shall hear of it and fear. So they'll know, if I do this, if a son says, I want to do this, I want to pursue, this lifestyle of doing whatever I want, I don't want to listen to authority. But then you have this, well, if I do that to the extreme, then this might happen. Maybe I better not. Or some people just rush blindly ahead anyway. But here you can be executed, so it has a preventative effect. 22, and if a man has committed a sin worthy of death, and he is put to death, you hang him on a tree. His corpse shall not hang all night on the tree, but you shall surely bury him on the same day. For he who is hanged is accursed of God, so that you do not defile your land, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. So interesting here. As a general principle, 22, if a person has committed a sin worthy of death, then he's to be put to death. And you'll notice here, he is put to death. Okay, the means is up to you. You could stone him, you could do whatever, right? And then after that, and you hang him on a tree. So he's put to death, and he goes up, and he's hung on a tree as a display. So people can see this and say, oh my, And this is one of the things too, when you think about what happened, like if we go forward in time to the Romans, then what did they say of Jesus, the King of the Jews? That was, basically a crime in and of itself. I mean, there was only one king, and that was Caesar. But normally speaking, if you're a criminal, then you would have a placard or some type of the charges, if you will, nailed to the cross. what crime you committed, why you're being executed, so people could see that and look at you. And this was an example. But here, according to the law, you had to take the body down. You couldn't just let a body, hang it and let it rot. That's what the Romans did. They would just let them rot a lot of times. And, nothing like going into, like in certain cases in Jerusalem, and you have the ways lined by, can you imagine, hundreds of people crucified. And there's only one way. You can't take the alternate way. It's not like looking at, GPS. Well, I don't think I'll take that way today. Traffic or whatever. No, you have to take this path. And because you have to take that, then that's where we're going to have all the bodies. So you have to go by and you're going to see this. So to hang on a tree was to publicly display the body of one who was executed. Joshua 8:29. One of the cities of the conquest that Joshua encountered was Ai. And so he did battle with them. And Joshua took captive the king of Ai. And we see that, again, this is total war when they went in to conquer the land. If we look up to verse 23. But they took alive the king of Ai and brought him to Joshua. And now it came about when Israel had finished killing all the inhabitants of Ai in the field in the wilderness where they pursued them. And all of them were fallen by the edge of the sword until they were destroyed. Then all Israel returned to Ai and struck it with the edge of the sword. And all who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. For Joshua did not withdraw his hand for which he stretched out the javelin until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. Israel took only the cattle and spoiled the city as plunder for themselves according to the word of the Lord, which he had commanded Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it a heap forever, a desolation until this day. And he hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening, and at sunset Joshua gave command, and they took his body down from the tree and threw it at the entrance of the city gate and raised over it a great heap of stones that stands to this day. So he killed him and then hung him up as a display, and then threw him in a heap, basically buried him with the rest of the city. And this was one of those things that Ai was not to be rebuilt. 17, the details of the matter were recorded in the book of the Chronicles before the king. All right, that's the end of chapter 2 there. Briefly look at the doctrine of violence here. Within our context, we have the assassination plot. We have a great deal of plotted violence against the Jews coming up in our context. And then also, too, in our modern context, you have violence all around you. So this is a appropriate doctrine at this point. Again, just a short one. One, preliminary considerations. A, violence is an exertion of physical force so as to injure or abuse an act of aggression. B, it may also be exhibited in vehement feeling or expression, which is often independent of any physical force. C, in certain cases, violence suggests moral corruption, unrighteousness, or sin. D, an understanding of violence from the biblical view is necessary and germane to our time in history, the last days of the church age. E, every level of our society is marred by violence to some degree. I mean, really, if you look around. F, Paul prophesied that violence and brutality would be prominent features of mankind in the last days. 2 Timothy 3:1. But realize this, literally know this, Paul tells Timothy, that in the last days And that's referring to, again, this is prophetic. This is not referring to their time in history, although there was a great deal of violence during this time. That is documented. I mean, mankind has always had a great deal of violence. However, what is one of the things notable in the last days will be very violent, exceedingly violent. You realize this in the last days, violent, your perilous times will come, because men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. So you're holding to a form of godliness, although they denied its power, and avoid such men as these. So all of these things we have: lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers. Revilers would be those who are blasphemous, essentially speaking against God, which we have all around us as well. Disobedient to parents, just general rejection of authority in this. Well, if the parent's not going to teach a child, discipline them appropriately and so forth, and certainly not enforce it, that's the other thing too. Enforcement is key. You can talk all you want. It's just like the laws on the books now. If we didn't have a police force to enforce them, basically be worthless. They'd just be, words on paper, so to speak. And so here we need parents in this day and age. They just really do not discipline their children in a lot of different ways appropriately. And, I look at it this way. For that reason now, I say this, and from my perspective, I'm very thankful that my mother in particular, she was a disciplinarian, and that doesn't mean I listened to her all the time. No, but I know this, that when I got older, there's really not a whole lot she could do physically. If I said I was going to go out, she couldn't physically stop me. Then, see, that's where the arrogance, disobedience to parents, well, she was smart. Then she get my brother-in-laws who could enforce things, and did, and I respected that. And I respect her now for, being a disciplinarian and so forth. It wasn't fun then, obviously. But I really see this, and it was absolutely necessary, and I really shudder to think that where I would be without any form of discipline and without certain people in my life that stepped up and said, no, you're not going to do this. And where I listened, or I was forced to listen, then, where I would be had I not done that. So I'm very thankful for that. But now, it is something that you don't see a lot of this. You don't. It's well documented with this. But I treat it this way. It's the last days, but certainly doctrinal parents need to stick up, and if there's children at home, you need to enforce it. And if you're not, then you're not doing your job. And it doesn't matter if you did your job, for 10 years, and then there's no time off. If they're under your roof, you let them there, you enforce it, period. And there's no gray area on this. It doesn't matter if they think they're adults, they're under your roof, they're your children. So you have to enforce things, doctrinal things. That's one thing my mother said. I remember this. It was very simple. If you don't like my rules, you can leave. There was no discussion. And she said this, I don't know how many times. And I knew too that, I would be forced to leave too if I couldn't continue to get away with certain behaviors. I had an uncle, I told you this one time, I was involved with some shenanigans, and he said, I will fly out there. I was in Colorado, he's in California. I'll fly out there tonight and break your nose. And I thought, well, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's going to happen. I said, okay, and I ceased and desisted, at least for a little bit on that. I didn't, but I knew that he would fly out. And even if he didn't actually break my nose, he would try. And, it wouldn't be pleasant either way. But I knew he was fully committed to backing my mother up. And my mom, is at that point, I was a teenager. So, Wasn't a little guy. But anyway, I'm thankful now, I really am, for the discipline. And it's necessary. I see this now. Absolutely necessary. And I see where there's no discipline, we want to be friends with children and stuff like that. Your children, I don't care if they're adults or not. If you allow them to get away with things and you don't call them on it and challenge them, you're not doing them any favors. You're not helping them grow. It's not edifying. It doesn't further their path with Bible doctrine, and it's a violation of Bible doctrine, as a matter of fact, if you're not calling them out and enforcing Bible doctrine. And if you continue to do that, then you can expect getting jammed up by God, period. I mean, it's that simple. G, accordingly, the believer ought to be able to cope with its many manifestations. H, prior to being able to cope with violence, the believer must first examine it from the biblical perspective. I, we must bear in mind that the diligent acquisition and understanding of divine viewpoint builds a foundation for future application in the Christian way of life. You have to have God's knowledge to act upon it. Of course, you can't apply what you don't know. So we have to build a frame of reference. 2, what is the origin of sinful violence? Well, A, prior to the fall of Satan, violence was non-existent. B, at some point, Satan became internally filled with violence. Look at Ezekiel 28:16. We've been over this before, but if you were to start in verse 11 and following, you would see that this is not a reference to, you have an address here to a king of Tyre. This is the king of Tyre actually in verse 12. And when you start reading this, you know, it's very apparent. This is not a normal address to an actual ruler. And we see that when you study this out, it's actually addressing Satan, who is otherwise cryptically known as the king of Tyre in this particular point. And what makes it kind of interesting, because when you look at verse 1, 28:1, there was an actual king of Tyre, but then a lot of times you have to be sensitive in context, because then the reference point will change, and all of a sudden this launches into something entirely different. This person is also known as the king of Tyre, but it has nothing to do with the historical figure at all of the actual king of Tyre, the city of Tyre. So here you have Satan being referenced, and I guess verse 11 here again, the word of the Lord came to me saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation over the king of Tyre and say to him, Thus says the Lord God, you have the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Okay, so this is, again, clearly not a historical figure as we go on here. You are in Eden in the garden of God. That automatically too disqualifies any actual historical figure. When you look at this, every precious stone is your covering: the ruby, the topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the lapis lazuli, the turquoise, and the emerald, and the gold. The workmanship of your settings and sockets was in you. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were an anointed cherub who covers. Here's the dead giveaway. A cherub, this is the most powerful class of angelic beings that God created. And here was Satan. He was in the privileged position. You are the anointed cherub who covers, and I placed you there. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created. So, again, all angelic beings, their creation preceded mankind's. They were created perfect. But also with volition. There's angelic volition. Until unrighteousness was found in you. By the abundance of your trade, you were internally filled with violence, and you sinned. Therefore, I've cast you as profane from the mountain of God, and I have destroyed you, a covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom by reason of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I put you before kings that they may see you. So here you have the sentence. And he is permanently disgraced and cast out of, basically the throne room of heaven. And so we see, though, this violence, internal violence, this sin originated within Satan. It was his own volition. Because he's created perfect. I mean, this is absolutely explicit. And this sets the stage here when we understand volition. Angels have it. Humans have it. We make the choices. Only now, obviously, we are in a fallen condition. So, but we still have volition, whether to follow, God or not. In that sense, whether to believe in Jesus Christ or not.